Wakanyi, thanks to everyone who's joining us today. And I'm an African storyteller, or a storyteller from Africa. That's what I usually go by. And I'm also a self-proclaimed global nomad, which is something I'm really proud of. I think I feel like it's part of my roots that I carry with me everywhere around the world. And I'm currently based in the Netherlands, and I recently released my first children's book, picture book.
Yes, and I think that probably the topic about being a global nomad will come up, because if I understand correctly, that was part of why you wrote the book. Why don't you, well, before we get to that though, why don't you tell us, because I was looking at your background, you know, we've been friends for a long time, but I don't think I had even realized everything that you've been doing. Why don't you tell us, how did you end up becoming an author? What made you decide to write a children's book?
Right, that's kind of a funny story. So I have 4 children. I'm also a mom to 4 kids. And it was around, I think 4 years ago, when my youngest was in 3, and there was this children's festival in Singapore that I had been invited to several years prior to that year that I traveled there. And I just never got around to making it because I was either pregnant or nursing a baby. And I'd always think it's a little bit tricky to take a child, you know, around in such places. And so finally, my youngest was 3, and I thought, you know what, this is the year that I'm going to do it. So I traveled to Singapore, and we'd just been back to Kenya, my home country, the previous year. So I traveled all the way to Singapore from Nairobi by myself, and I felt like this was my maiden trip, somewhere alone without the kids.
Right.
And, during that time, I met some amazing authors and illustrators, and, you know, it was almost like just the right place for someone who's aspiring to be an author, to meet others and be immersed in that world. And my most amazing encounters happened there, and therefore my inspiration to write. I met 2 brilliant authors, one of who is renowned Irish Nobel laureate P.J. Lynch, and the other one is James Mayhew, and we've remained friends since. And they kind of gave me that talking to, you know, they told me, look, you can do this, you've got it, you've got a story, and you just do it. And so then, you know, from there on, the seed was planted or watered, it was always there. And I thought, you know what, someday I'm just gonna go ahead and do it. And there we are, that's the story.
Now, did you know that this was the book you were going to write, or you just wanted to write children's books? Where did the idea for this particular book come from? And again, I'll just show it again. This is the 12 Days of African Safari. How did that one get started?
You know, I think, yes. To some extent, I think I always knew that I was going to write that book, because the story behind that book was actually an inspiration from another book with a similar title, The 12 Days of Christmas in Thailand. And we used to, 3 of my children are born in Bangkok, actually. And so then when we were living there, at some point, I met an author who's sadly not with us anymore. And we met at a local market, and she was selling her book, The 12 Days of Christmas in Thailand. And I love Christmas. And so we got talking about that. And I told her how much my kids and I love Christmas. And we had, at that point, been making up the song, The 12 Days of Christmas in Kenya. And she said, you know what, you should someday write that story. And I said, you know what, I think I will someday. And that was a long time ago. It's probably now over a decade ago. And then, of course, you know, when I thought about writing a book, I thought that would be the first book I would want to write about, would be The 12 Days of Christmas in Kenya. And so then I called it The 12 Days of Christmas Safari.
It's a beautiful book. For those who haven't seen it, I was actually just reading with my daughter last night. The illustrations are amazing, these gorgeous paintings, and it's all about the wildlife on the African savanna, well, specifically Kenya, right? And it's really fun because it's a Christmas book, and everybody knows the tune. So like, we were singing it as we were doing our bedtime story last night. She had so much fun with that. And it's neat because you get to learn all of these animals, and they really get to appreciate them. Like, I think the one that struck her, she just kept thinking, hold on, let me see if I can find it. The hippos humming. She was like, do hippos hum? I was like, you know, I don't know. I guess they hum
They
because
do.
it's six hippos humming. And my favorite part was the five lion cubs.
Aww.
That's my favorite part of the song anyway. But it's really beautiful, and the text, it goes so well with that song. I mean, it's just really well done. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
What kind of reception have you gotten from it?
You know, we've had an amazing reception from people around the world, and actually back at home in Kenya, a lot of people appreciate the fact that I thought about writing a book set in Kenya about something that is so global. You know, Christmas is one of those holidays, celebrations that are celebrated around the world in most countries, and so a lot of people can identify with that, even if you're not Christian or whatever. You know, it's Christmas. You know, it transcends the religious aspect of it, and also it's not such a shocking thing to think about, you know, Christmas in Kenya, but yet when you look around, I mean, if you do a little Google search, you find absolutely almost nothing really about how Christmas traditions are in parts of Africa. And so I thought this is really strange. I mean, we are big on this holiday. We love our Christmases, and it's a gorgeous time of the year as well. The sun is always shining. The Masai Mara is always lush and beautiful. And I thought, you know what, that's where the book needs to be set. It needs to be set in the wild, in the actual bush, where things actually do look like what one thinks of Africa. So it's a little bit stereotypical in that way, but at the same time, it's not. It's actually, it does look exactly like that. And Milena, the illustrator, she and I met around the same time that I moved back home 4 years ago. And we were talking about it, and she's
actually in Kenya, right?
Yes, she's based in Kenya. She's a wildlife artist, and she's lived in Kenya throughout her childhood. She's an amazing, she's got an amazing eye for animals in the bush. And I think, I mean, like you mentioned, the five lion cubs, that was one of my favorite pages as well. And I remember saying to her, gosh, they're looking at me, you know, I can see, I can sense it in the same way. She's got that childlike flair to her art, and I just adore that. Yeah.
Yeah, or like the buffaloes staring. They really look like they're staring right at you.
And they actually do. I mean, when you go on safari, that's one of the things that my kids love is, you know, let's find the buffalo, the one that's got the meanest look, you know, staring right at you. So we talked about that. You know, Milena is very much aware of all of that. Of course, she's always in the bush. In fact, I think some of the paintings were done while she was on safari. So it's just amazing to feel that energy fall on the book. And it has sort of a kind of an artist, you know, a texture of a canvas. And I wanted that to really be a part of the book as well.
Yes, that was really unusual. You felt like you were really looking at the painting itself, like you could touch it. I almost felt like I could feel the texture of the painting if I touched the page. It's beautiful.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah, that's great feedback. Yeah.
Well, and so storytelling is really something that you grew up with. You mentioned that you're a storyteller, and you've talked, you've written about how your grandmother was a storyteller. Can you talk about that, and then how this ties into like the African Folktales project?
Right.
Why are folktales so important, you think?
That's a great question. Well, this is what I believe. I believe that all of us currently, the citizens of this world, are the indigenous earth keepers, right? So each one of us, from wherever we are the indigenous global citizens. And so I think folktales are our reminder of who we were, and also in a way our roadmap for where we want to be, who we want to become as one sort of, you know, one global human race. And to lose those folktales would also mean to lose a bit of our identity as who we are as humans. We are intricately tied to the natural world. That's our home. That's our natural environment. And our folktales, you know, if you look at folktales all around the world, you will almost always find some kind of theme that is tied to what people did in the wild, or what people did in the bush, what people planted or ate, how people interacted with animals. And that's really central to what folktales in Africa are about. However, folktales in Africa were passed down orally. I might be one of the last generation of kids that got this opportunity to sit under an acacia tree or whatever tree and get a story told to you sort of in that natural way. That doesn't happen anymore. And it's a real tragedy. And I think it's a tragedy around the world. But for me personally, I feel a serious connection to the stories and a real need and an urgent need to want to preserve them. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. And especially because I've got mixed race kids, so they have one part of me and a different heritage as well. And that other part of them tends to be the more told story. You know, you find lots of folktales from European countries or the US or England, but you don't really find stories written about Africa in the way that my grandmother told those stories, because they were passed down orally. So I thought, you know, how else can we tell these stories without losing the essence of oral storytelling? So I have reimagined a lot of the stories that were told to me and sort of tried to keep the essence and try and leave them as open-ended. So they're a bit unusual in the sense that they don't really end with necessarily the happy, upbeat, you know, everything went well and everybody, you know, went back to normal, or they fell in love and life carried on. All of that is true and it's there, you know. But at the same time, I want to give children an opportunity to think about telling this story as their own story and passing it down to their, you know, to their friends and other children elsewhere, rather than have an end to it. Because folktales never actually were meant to be set at a certain time. So any story that I tell today has evolved. You know, it's not the original story, and we'll never know what the original story was. But the value or the essence of the message is always passed down, and that's really the point of the African Folktales Project, is to preserve that essence of storytelling and to share it with everyone and to give ownership to everybody. These are all our stories. We all own African stories as much as we own, you know, Anglo-Saxon stories. So I just want these stories to be out there and to be shared by everyone, and everybody can have a little sense of who we were in the past and where we're going based on these stories.
That is so beautiful. I mean, it almost sounds like you're talking about, instead of like what we normally think of as a book or a story, like you said, you know, once they get written down, they're really set in stone, and you tend to say it the same way. It sounds more like you're giving people a template. Like you said, the essence of the story for them to become storytellers also.
Exactly.
But they can tell it in their own way and in their own, you know, appropriate for their own time.
Right. And I think that's what was exciting to me as a child, being told these stories. I know that my grandmothers expected me to just carry on with the story. In fact, half the time they didn't even finish the stories. You know, they'd start off on one story and sort of coyly move on to another thing, and then you're left thinking, oh, but tell me what happened there, you know. And they're like, well, what do you think, you know? So and that's why they were orally told. They weren't meant to be. In fact, I think they made them up as they went along. But the value, the message, whatever it is that they wanted the message to be, was always with them. So the story, the characters, and the environment and the atmosphere was made up as you went along, depending on what situation you're in. And that's what I really love about this kind of, you know, orally told story, that tradition, that ancient tradition of telling, which is what we're doing. You know, we do this all the time. You and I are telling stories, right? But then, you know, you take one story from one context and you put it in another, and you can't do that if you don't lose the meaning, you know, if you don't lose the connection between two people. So that's what I want to find, that connection between children around the world.
And so how are you doing that with the African Folktales Project? I know, I mean, you have the website, and I think you mentioned that you were actually working on a picture book right now.
Right. So Milena and I have formed sort of a partnership. She's the illustrator for the 12 Days of Christmas Safari. And right now we've got about 10 stories, 10 folktales that I researched. So during my graduate studies, I did a bit of global development education, and I wanted to find a way to embed Indigenous knowledge into mainstream education, because that's one way of getting this is what I'm talking about, you know, the folktales and the folk wisdom into sort of a formalized education system, because at the moment it's completely separate. So you've got the folk tales and the Indigenous knowledge on one side, is sort of that traditional nice to have little thing, and then you've got really formal Western style education, which has now, you know, transformed into a global thing. But at the same time, we're losing touch with that Indigenous knowledge. So through that, I realized that in order for me to understand indigenous knowledge in my own culture in Africa, I had to get to the stories, which is, you know, something I hadn't even thought, you know, the connection. Of course, that's the only way that they taught. You know, storytelling was sort of the pedagogy, right, for learning about plants, species, or animals, or climate change, and all these sustainable development goals that we're now talking about were actually being considered back then through those folktales, and have been. You know, we've always been dealing with the challenges of sustainable development. And now we have them as a formal goals, you know, 17 of them. So I thought, you know, why not take those goals and find the stories that are actually tied to the sustainable development goals, and try and find a way to bring them into the formal sort of publishing medium. And so I thought, you know, picture books, it's perfect.
Right. I mean, it's brilliant. I went back and reread an article you wrote for Multicultural Kid Blogs. I can't remember exactly when, several years ago, about indigenous knowledge and folktales. And I had never made that connection before. But once you said it, it seems so obvious that that is such a way that that indigenous knowledge about plants and animals and so on was passed on, in addition to these shared, really universal values. But like you said, it seems like that is often kept separate from formal education. So what a wonderful way to bring that together and to tie it to the sustainable development goals. I mean, it's just brilliant. I love that you're doing this, because like you said, it's all there. People have been learning about it.
Yeah, right. And we do it. You know, I'm not even criticizing formal education. Teachers do tell stories. You know, everything that we learn, everything we're teaching children is through storytelling. In an English class, or in a language class, or in a mathematics class, we're all telling stories. You know, this plus this adds this, you know, and then there's a story behind that. So think about it. That's what our grandmothers did. That's why folktales, oral storytelling, was important. It's the only way that something could really stick. If you remember, if you can attach a certain thing, a certain idea with a story, then of course you remember it. And I think that's just the way that children learn naturally. So why not bring those stories to them? And why not use them to promote the SDGs? Which is what we're doing at the moment. So our first book is actually the one based out of that article that I wrote for Multicultural Kid.
Yes, I was wondering about that.
It's a baobab. Yeah, it's a story about the baobab tree, and it's got a bit of a twist. You know, the baobab tree was kind of a greedy figure in the wild, and so the story is tied to SDG 12. So if any of our viewers want to go to that, and it's around consumption or responsible consumption. And I thought, to me, that is such a timely theme. We didn't actually plan it, but now I think back and I think it is what all of us around the world are consumers. We're all consuming something, some perhaps more than others. You know, it doesn't matter where in the world you live, you're still a consumer to some extent. And so this SDG is actually one of those global goals that we can all kind of just immediately grasp onto and think, right, consciously, as a consumer, what is my responsibility for buying and and producing sustainably. And so the story of the baobab sort of is tied to that. And I hope that that's what our readers, our little ones, will get out of that.
Oh, I'm excited. I'm sorry, I just looked at the time, and I think it's time for us to wrap up, which is too bad, because I feel like I could keep on talking about this. I think it's so fascinating.
Thank you.
Which I think means that we need to have you back once your next picture book is out.
Thank you so much.
We can talk about it more. Yes, I would love to. Do you have an idea of when it's going to be published?
Yes. It will be out on Earth Day, spring 2022. So look out for that.
Wonderful.
That's around March. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Okay, well then we'll have to figure out a time for you to come back and talk to us about it. It has been such a pleasure to talk with you. I just feel like I learn so much every time I talk to you.
Thank
you for joining.
So much. Yeah.
Yes, and be sure to check her out. We've got her Instagram, and you can go to her blog, and also to the African Folktales Project. And of course, you want to get this for those that are on Amazon. I got mine in just a couple days, so it's still available if you want to get it before Christmas. So Brilliant. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Liana.
Take care. Merry Christmas.